All right, I think we can just get started. So first, I just want to thank you all and thank Dale for being on tonight and taking time out of your night to listen. I encourage everybody to turn their camera on if they can. You don't have to, but it would be nice because it's just very rewarding and engaging for Dale to be able to see real-time reactions. With that, also the rules are changing a little bit this time. I know the last two sessions I have not recorded, but I will be recording the first part of this one, just the part where I do the Q&A, but the audience Q&A will not be recorded, so you don't have to worry about that. So you will have the ability to send me questions as they arise for you. Just in the chat, and then when I open it up to audience Q&A, I'll just call on your name and ask you to unmute yourself. With that, we can just get started. We're just so honored to have you on tonight, Dale. Dale has had such a rich and varied career. We'll try to cover everything in the session, but again, it's only about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. So we're not going to be able to cover everything, but I'm sorry, I'm admitting people from the waiting room still. Anyway, so she's been a practitioner for over 40 years, but the start of her career was not in psychology, so it'll be interesting for us to listen to. She's an expert in relationships, caregiving, well-being, balance, and much, much more. So I'm very excited to have you on tonight, Dale.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Hello, everyone.
What's that?
I just said hello to everyone.
So I guess we can start with right after you graduated NYU with a degree in speech and history, not psychology.
No, not psychology.
What was the direction you took after that? And specifically, how did a background in education help, with history, help in your next steps?
Let's see, I did take some psychology classes as an undergraduate, and I was always interested in psychology. I was very interested in education, and when I was an undergraduate, I volunteered with children who had special needs, and that was very gratifying to me. I had done that actually when I was a girl as well, and working in summer camps and summer day camps. And my first job out of college was, I thought I wanted to go to graduate school in art history, but my first job out of college was to be the head counselor of a tennis and ski camp in Austria. And I thought that it would be good to travel. I had been a lifeguard. I loved skiing. I had been a counselor. They needed a lot of people to fill one job, and I felt I could apply. And so I ended up I just turned 21, and I was head counselor of a camp in Meyerhofen, Austria, which was in the southern Alps, the Tyrolean Alps. And it was crazy. I mean, there were half European kids and half American kids, and I would take them on tours all over places that I didn't speak the language. And this is important because I think you have to be bold, and I think you have to just try and, if you see something that's interesting to you, try and do it. Unfortunately, I had a really bad ski accident and came home on a stretcher and was in and out of rehab for about a year. And that really changed the trajectory of my life dramatically. And so I was very involved in rehab for myself. And then as I got better, I started to work with other patients who were in different hospitals that I was in. And then I was working at NYU, actually, as a research assistant, because one of my professors, when I was an undergrad, we became friends. I was friends with his family, and he visited me when I was recuperating, and he had just been given a grant. This was in 1970, and he asked if I wanted to, do some research on the grant, which was quite generous of him because he really was trying to keep my sanity. And so I was able to take classes at NYU, and I then ended up working with the assistant dean of instruction and as his assistant. And I took more classes, and the classes I was taking were at that time in special education. And I decided that I wanted to get a master's degree in specializing in education with children who had differences, and specifically my interest was in deafness and hard of hearing. Simultaneously, I had met a kid who had a very significant learning disability, and I kind of tutored her as I was getting better. I was by that time, I think, on crutches, and that whole world became very interesting to me. So fast forward, I got my master's. I traveled again some more. I was very interested in people who lived in other cultures, in other parts of the world, um, and also within the United States. And I volunteered in different communities. And then I got a job in Israel, and I was working there. I had been offered a job in Hong Kong, and one in Israel, and one in California. And I wanted to work with new immigrants, and I went to Israel, and I was teaching deaf children, and I was teaching very young children and their parents, really, because my student teaching had been in a school, but I really wanted, and I was working with teenagers, young teenagers, and I loved that. But I wanted to work with families. I wanted to work with parents because didn't have any experience with parents of young children. They wouldn't give me work. So it was impossible to get the experience. But this job in Israel offered me that opportunity. So I was kind of flying blind, but I really loved it. Unfortunately, while I was there, the 1973 war broke out. And so I ended up not working for a while and volunteering in lots of different communities. But I also volunteered. One of the places was a development town, and I taught in that development town. My Hebrew was terrible, but because I had a lot of experience working with children who really were not able to express language aside from using their bodies, I was able to communicate pretty well, I think. I came back from there. I went to California. I got a fellowship in working with deaf children and very young children, very young children of parents. I worked with siblings, got very interested in the sibling relationship in families where there were children with special needs. And then my life changed again. And I decided that I wanted to study more about, quote, normal development instead of development where there was something that was in those days called special and different. So there was a woman who was teaching at UCLA. Her name's Norma Feshbach. She recently retired. We are still connected. She just celebrated her 95th birthday. And she was doing research in the area of empathy and fantasy and emotional responsiveness and maternal stress and all the things that I really was interested in. And I wanted to really understand what was going on in these families where children were in need of extra familial time, extra and different education. And I presented my idea to her of what I wanted to study. And she said, I think that would work, but I had to cobble together a program from special education and early childhood and developmental studies and clinical psychology. And that hadn't been done before, but everybody was really supportive. And so I got my doctorate in early childhood and worked in clinical. And my graduate dissertation was in siblings of children who had siblings of children who had special needs. And for my control group, I just studied siblings who were in families with children who didn't have special needs. And that became, that was the basis for my first book, which was called Sisters. When I finished my doctorate, I wanted to teach, I wanted to do research, but I didn't want to do either full time. And so I had actually just finished working on the book. I was doing seminars all over the country. And what I wanted to do was use psychology to try and work not only in research, but teach and really try and reach people in different neighborhoods, people with different backgrounds. And I didn't want to set up a private practice right away. So that's what I did. I taught and I did seminars and I wrote. And it wasn't till years later that I went into private practice, which I love. And and that's kind of what I did. And then I started working in the media, and I started doing television and talking about psychology on television. So that's kind of like the long and short of it.
There's a lot to unpack here. I want to first touch on the fact that you took a lot of time between finishing your undergraduate degree and then going and pursuing your PhD. How did that experience, specifically in education and working with deaf and hard of hearing kids in Israel, inform your then pursuing psychology?
I was working with families in New York first, then in Israel, and then in California. And there was a theme that I kept seeing, and it had to do with a lot of people were, quote, blaming behaviors and all kinds of things on the fact that the child had this disability. And people did not, in those days, this was in the 70s, were not really that cognizant of what else was going on with the child, and that a lot of things was just normal development. But I didn't have the background in early childhood or just regular development to really understand what was the difference. Intuitively, I knew, but I needed to have the research, I needed to have the training. And I just wanted to be able to work with families, particularly parents, to help them through what in those days was a model that was really the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model of death and dying and grief. And so parents were expected to have an initial reaction of shock and then deny, and they would go through, and people were expecting them to go through and then get through and leave behind them whatever their emotional response was. So kind of like after you were angry, you weren't supposed to be angry anymore. And after you were disappointed and after you were in shock, you're supposed to leave that behind. Well, it doesn't happen with death, and it certainly doesn't happen with adaptation in a family where there's a child who's not the child you expected. And there was a lot of pressure I felt from professionals on parents to just hurry up and get through it, get through your emotional responses, because you had a lot of work to do. You had to catch up with your child as far as their education. And in these days, it was, the Public Law 94-142 hadn't yet passed, and it ultimately did pass, so that children were going to be able to group of professionals, and their parents would have a say in what their educational strategy was going to be. But it was kind of like the Wild West. And my feeling was that here are these parents who are working so hard to educate their kids and try and find an equal opportunity for their children in a neighborhood school or a special school, or maybe they kind of fit them in. And a lot of these kids who were deaf at that time were children from the rubella epidemic. And so they not only were deaf and hard of hearing, they also had other disabilities, and they didn't fit anywhere. And so parents were working very hard and were expected to be able to not only educate their children, but understand all of the medical underpinnings of what needed to be addressed. There were very few communities to help and support parents. There were very few parent groups. And one of the things that I did, I was at a place in California where there were parent groups. So I was able to not only lead a parent group for the emotional response, but also for the educational part. And it was very helpful because parents are the best support system for one another. And just being able to kind of moderate a group and see what happens when connections are made among people who have a similar issue is really remarkable. As I mentioned before, I was really interested in siblings, so I wanted to learn more about the sibling in the family who did not have a disability and why so many of them were really doing really well in school and trying not to disturb their parents and try to be super achievers, and sometimes were acknowledged and sometimes weren't. So that's kind of, I wanted to work and I wanted to get really in the field. And then I just felt I need more training. And the training I need is in psychology and normal development and parenting. And that's really how I came to it. And I was older than many of the other students, but I didn't care.
I want to know what went into your decision to become a therapist specifically. There are a lot of people in this group who are considering a career in clinical psychology, or counseling psychology. What was going through your mind when you were making this decision? And now looking back, what advice would you give to us if we're considering that career path?
I really enjoyed and learned a lot from people who were trying to deal with difficulties in their lives. I was always attracted to family dynamics. I was always attracted to trying to understand from many different perspectives what affects the way we function, what affects our behavior, what affects our thought processes. I've always been interested in early development and family dynamics. And I felt that one could do a lot with working one-on-one. One could do a lot with working with families, because really I went into therapy to become a therapist to work with families. I didn't really think that I was going to be working with individuals. It was all about working with couples who were dealing with things that either a child who had a disability or somebody who was sick or something. But it was really about the family for me in those days. It still is, by the way. But I then found that sometimes talking with individuals in the families that I was working with was very helpful to me, because there was a lot of secret stuff that was going on that nobody wanted to talk about in front of the other people in their family, but they were more than happy to share in a private session. So helping people to come to what they needed to share in their families could only be done with talking to them individually. Once I started working with individuals, and in those days I loved working with kids, and I would work with kids as well as adolescents. I'd work with adolescents and their parents. So there were different dynamics in the room, so to speak. But I really felt that sometimes people just needed someone to bounce off what they were struggling with and not be judged. Because very often my experience was, particularly with these families, and I referenced it before, teachers and administrators were not intending to be judgmental. I don't think people go in to try and make parents feel badly about what they're doing or the situation that they have. But because parents often feel that something was wrong with them if they had a child who was not the child they expected, anything that is felt like judgment, criticism, or anything like that is taken very, very hard and very seriously. And it's, for so many families, it's like they can't do enough. Work really hard, and they really do a lot, but they feel it's never enough. Their kids are never going to be just like the kids in the playground, and they're always going to be trying to, defend their kid or advocate for their kid. And things have changed a lot in these last 50 years, all right? In some ways. But in some ways they haven't. I mean, I just got an email today from a woman I worked with when she was a little girl, and she now has children of her own, and she's a journalist. And she just wrote a wonderful piece about, in this age of masks, how people who are reading your lips and people who have cochlear implants, putting a mask on when you have cochlear implant, or putting a mask on that you can't see through is it's curtains. I mean, you really cannot communicate. And to be able to, again, raise the sensitivity of an entire society about, hey, there are people who have an inability to communicate with you when you're wearing a mask. So how about we try and make clear masks for some people, or at least understand? These are the things, as far as public awareness, that I think is always a part of doing therapy. Because whether it's suicide prevention, whether it's domestic violence, whatever it is, I think that when one is a therapist, in my view, you're also an advocate.
I think you're touching on something here that makes your career special, and something that we can learn specifically from you, which is, I mean, I think your work is only as good as how well you communicate it to others. And as someone who's run the gamut from appearing on mainstream media to speaking with parents and getting the word out on what you know to be true about parenting, to writing books about all of that work, how do you recommend that we gain these skills to be able to communicate well this science and what we know from our practice?
Listen and watch. I mean, really listen to what people are saying to you. I mean, people referred to me as a parenting expert when I was a kid. And, I didn't have kids. and when I had my kids and grandkids, I said, oh God, I wish I could do that again. I think that we have to, it's a balance. We have to be confident that what we know is hopefully going to be helpful, but we also have to understand that this person who you're talking to is different from any other person who has ever sat in your office or across from you. And you may think that you know them because you've seen people like them, but you don't. And we have to listen really carefully to understand what this person's experience is. And we have to be really careful not to talk when there's silence and to fill that silence, because that silence can be very, very important. And I remember as a young therapist, I was uncomfortable with those silences. And I kind of felt like I needed to ask a question. Sometimes yes, but not always. So I think that's one thing, to really listen. I think observing other professionals, trying to have mentors, approach people who you admire or people whose work you know. I would write letters to people whose work I really was interested in, and I would talk to them about their research. I would make appointments to do that, and I would have specific questions. The other thing that was helpful to me was, if I didn't understand something, which I didn't understand a lot of things, this was before the internet. Okay, I mean, you go to the library and you find, whatever studies you were looking for, and you get them on microfiche. And I feel like a dinosaur, but that's what it took. And I would knock on doors and I would ask people about their work, and I would ask them what they were studying before they were studying this, how this came about, because I think that's really important to understand. What you're doing, Maya, is understands people's journey. But I think mentors are amazing. You have to be willing to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to say, even if you're walking around with a PhD or an MA or whatever, that you don't know, or you didn't learn that, or that's not your strong suit, and learn, keep learning. I mean, I was on the phone today with an administrator in California who is always taking classes. She's so impressive. She knows more than almost everybody I know, and she's always learning, because there's always something to learn. If I were to do this again now, I'm sure I would go into the field of neuropsychology, because I mean, what we know now about the brain, which is so nothing, but we're learning so much more about the brain, for me, is incredible. So I'm really busy learning about the brain, and a lot of my work now has to do with that, and wellness, and positivity, and the differences between a depressed brain and a content brain, and I think that my experience also is to work with people from different disciplines and to step out of your own comfort area and just be on interdisciplinary teams, because you don't have to be, people don't have to know how smart you are. You just have to be okay with what you know, and then be open to learning more. And I think sharing what you know and listening to what other people know and building up your knowledge base is really a wonderful thing to do. The other thing I would say is, don't be afraid of your own life experience. My professional life changed 180 degrees when my father had Alzheimer's disease. And my father has been dead for 25 years. He was sick for 13 years. He got very sick very young. People didn't know about Alzheimer's, and we were inventing it as we went along. The work that I do today in Alzheimer's and in brain research, and I'm so happy that I can work with neurologists and medical students and help them understand what happens in a family, what happens with caregivers, because I share my own experience, and I've been fortunate enough to have maybe thousands of people share with me their experiences. I don't think that I really have these answers. I think that I've been very lucky that people have shared their stories with me, and I share their stories through a filter of research or psychology tenets. I think kind of like that's what my role is.
How do you cultivate?
How do I what?
How do you cultivate worthiness, and then I think worthiness to be able to share your story and be vulnerable in that way, and how do you be sure of yourself? How do you rely on your experiences in that way? How did you learn that?
I knew they were real. I didn't have to prove anything to anybody. When I talk about my own experiences, I have to talk about my own vulnerabilities in participating in those experiences. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I don't. I mean, I have confidence in a lot of areas, but I don't always have confidence in everything I do. Not by a long shot. I mean, if I'm struggling with someone who's struggling, I will say, I'm not sure where we're going to go from here. I mean, we have to, we need more information, or you're sharing something with me about which I know nothing. I need to learn. And when you work with people who have, in my case, different medical conditions, I mean, I'm not a physician. I learn a lot, but I'm not going to be able to give them information about their medical condition, but I can give them information and perhaps tools, hopefully, to deal with the emotions they have in adapting to life with a particular medical condition, or someone in their family that has something that they never expected, or a total change of circumstance, whether it's financial or whatever it is. I think the confidence comes in what works. What has worked for other people, and I think that's all you can say. This has worked for other people who have a similar situation as you. It might work. Why don't we try it? And basically, you're there to not only witness someone as they try something or go on their journey, but to support them. And when they really hit a wall, you're there. You don't have to fix it. You can't fix it, but you can support their questioning. And I think by sharing your own vulnerability, that is helpful. I mean, when I trained, you were supposed to have a face like this. You couldn't show any emotion. You couldn't have pictures of your family in your office. I mean, nobody could know anybody's life. It was very separate. I didn't like that. It didn't feel good to me. It didn't feel like me. And I worked differently, and it was difficult for me. But now it's okay to work that way. It's okay to breathe with a client. It's okay to teach them ways to manage anxiety that, is kind of like in the closet. And I think that, thank goodness, people are much more taking a much more integrative approach to mental health and understand the impact of issues like early development, education, poverty. I mean, there's so much domestic violence that impacts each person who walks into our office space. And we just have to learn from them And I guess you develop confidence with experience.